Hi everyone, this is Mr. Fokowski, and for part two, we're going to be looking at public opinion, which I find to be one of the more interesting units and hands-on units of AP Gov. So let me start off by asking you, where do you stand on some of these issues based on maybe the war in Afghanistan, debt, global warming, abortion, healthcare, affirmative action? So formulate your opinion, where you stand. And you probably think, hey, I came up with, my stance all by myself. I am 100% responsible for my stance. Well, did you really come up with this stance on your own? And that's what we're going to be looking at. How were you able to formulate this? Was it really just you, or were there other factors involved? So let's talk about political socialization, which by definition is the process through which an individual acquires their particular political orientation. So as you grow older, that orientation becomes firmer and more definite, and ultimately the end result of this is your public opinion, where you stand on something. So most of your socialization in terms of your political knowledge and awareness is done informally. You might pick up from it from peers, you might absorb it from television, acquire it from reading the newspaper. But the process of political socialization begins with the family, right? The political leanings of children often are similar to their parents' leanings. So if I were to ask you, again, going back to what are your stances on the war in Afghanistan, what are your beliefs about the national debt, and I were to ask your parents the exact same question, chances are you're going to have very similar responses. And this is the biggest impact for children, and probably you today and myself, because you just pick up on things, right? You hear their side. It's not like this is a formal thing in which, your parents sit down and they say, hey, Johnny, let me tell you why I'm Republican. No, you just pick up things that you hear, maybe certain programs that they watch, you're absorbing and acquiring that information. So as a kid, even so, you're being socialized to politics, whether or not you realize it or not. Sometimes it's more definite when you see like a 5-year-old saying, oh, George Bush is the best president, or, Barack Obama is the best president, and you're like, well, how's that 5-year-old really going to come to that determination based on just being 5? And that's a key element of how the family really impacts the ways in which you are politically socialized. So the family, biggest impact for children. So in this chart, you'll see if both parents are Democrats, well, there's a 59% chance that you're going to be Democrat, whereas opposed to if both parents are Democrat, you have a 13% chance of being Republican based on polls. Same example here, if both parents are Republican, you have a 59% chance of being Republican according to this poll, whereas you have a mere 12% of being a Democrat. So generally, children follow their parents' footsteps. Otherwise, that's going to make for very awkward family functions. So other ways that we have the process of political socialization is through something called linkage institutions. One of the more notable ones is the media. So it's the chief source of information as children age, and there's even a generational gap in terms of viewing television news. Typically, even today, you have mainly older people who are attached and glued to the news and the media, and this is their chief source of information. And one of the more formal ways in which children are socialized politically is through school, right? The government wants to socialize youngsters into political culture because, you want every citizen involved in politics in terms of voting, because it's their civic duty, as we talked about with the political culture. So in general, better educated citizens are more likely to vote and are more knowledgeable of politics and policy. It makes sense. There is a liberalizing effect of college in that you go to college, more than likely you are to be more liberal in your ideology, which we'll get to in another lecture. In terms of your political learning over a lifetime, as your aging increases, political participation and strength of party attachment. So as you grow older, you're more likely to be involved in politics, whether that's just simply voting or maybe just writing a letter to the editor of a newspaper about some political issue. So in terms of turnouts by age, you can see only about 17% of people between the ages of 18 and 20 actually turned out for the 2006 congressional election. Whereas you see that as people get older, it's a nice little trend there. People tend to be more politically involved, especially senior citizens. I mean, look at these demographics here. If you're between 65 and 84, 62% of them are going to come out to vote. And that's a pretty impressive number compared to just 17% of 18 and 20-year-olds. And again, that sort of goes back to the lack of political engagement that we looked at during the political culture lecture, in which we saw that political knowledge and even engagement has been declining, especially since 1964. So, what Americans value in terms of political ideology. So, in terms of ideology, it's a coherent set of beliefs about politics, public policy, and public purpose. We tend to group people into two categories, one being liberals, the other ones being conservatives. So when we, talk about liberals and conservatives, these are two groups, but there are several other classifications you can lump people in, but these are the two main categories. So there's been a predominance of conservative over liberal thinking for the past few decades. So currently, roughly 38% of people are conservative, 24% are liberal, 38% are moderate. Yet if you're going to take the same ideologies and go into Europe, well, they're much more liberal in their thinking, because prior to 2011, most European countries had universal health care. They have a lot of social programs because there's a lot of liberal thinking. In the United States, where the ideology tends to be more conservative, you don't have those types of social programs because conservatives don't typically like a lot of social spending. When we talk about gender gap, well, that's the gap, the space between what men and women think about how government should be run. So in terms of ideology, women tend to be less conservative, whereas men tend to be more conservative. And depending on your ideology, it depends on a number of demographics, based on your location, your age. It can even depend on your religion, as you see here, amongst several other beliefs. But let's get, down to the basics as to what is a liberal. Well, liberals tend to believe they should spend less on military spending and focus it more on social issues. They are not so much gung-ho about going into wars or committing troops, so most liberals are against the war in Iraq when that was happening, in Afghanistan. In terms of social policy, they tend to support freedom of choice. If you look at gay marriage, they tend to favor that. In terms of economic policy, they think that the government should be more involved. They think in terms of taxes, they want the rich to be taxed more. That's been a very current debate. In terms of spending, they want the government to spend more, especially to help the poor. And in terms of crime, this is even interesting. They think to reduce crime, they believe that we should solve the problems that cause crime. So one thing might be to reduce poverty, because typically people who commit crimes are poor. In stark contrast with conservatives, they're typically more about maintaining peace through strength. So through our military, they like a big solid military in terms of numbers and strength. They're more likely to support military intervention as opposed to diplomacy. In terms of social issues, conservatives are more about the right to life, so they would be against abortion. With prayer in schools, they're typically more supportive with that. Even in terms of gay marriage, typically conservatives are against that. In terms of the scope of the government, they are all about keeping taxes low. They want to keep spending in terms of the government very low as well, so they would be very much against the amount of debt that the United States is in currently right now. And then in terms of crime, they see that we should stop coddling criminals. They shouldn't be given all these rights inside of prisons. That these laws that we allow them to escape on technicalities, such as pleading mental insanity, that shouldn't really be so. We should be tough on criminals, and that ultimately will reduce crime. Interesting opinions on that. Other influences on political socialization, major events such as the New Deal under FDR or even September 11th can shift one's political socialization and even how you stand on certain issues. In terms of religion, Catholics and Jews tend to be more liberal in their ideology, whereas Protestants and evangelicals, which typically reside in the South, tend to be more conservative. By occupation, again, by no means is this exhaustive. That's saying if you're a professor or you're a lawyer, you're definitely liberal. By no means is that the case. It just says that trends of within these certain occupations or religion or political events tend to influence your ideology. So professors, lawyers, they tend to be more liberal. If you're in the oil industry or construction, you tend to be more conservative. And you can even see how it varies by region. Typically, the Northeast is more liberal, the West Coast is liberal, and then when you get into the Midwest, Texas, as well as the Deep South, that is where you see much more conservatism. In terms of region, I just said that before, with New England being very much more conservative, Midwest very conservative. Even in terms of urban locations, you tend to have people be more liberal and democratic, I should say, whereas in smaller towns, you tend to see more conservatives, especially in rural areas. So think about Sussex County, we're a rural area. We have a high percentage of conservatives, yet if you go into Patterson, which is more urban, you have many, many more liberals and Democrats. In terms of social class, lower class typically turn out more democratically, but they, interestingly enough, have a lower turnout rate. The working class, which you can, categorize as blue collar, tend to vote more Democratic because Democrats are more in tune with their thinking. Middle class, this is where they're split in terms of ideology. Upper class tend to vote more Republican or more conservative. And in terms of race and ethnicity, whites tend to vote for more Republicans and conservatives, whereas blacks tend to vote for more Democrats and liberals. Hispanics also tend to vote more liberal and democratic, which is a major issue for the Republican Party because Hispanics are going to be the majority ethnicity. I think they estimate by the year 2030 or 2040. So for the Republicans to still have a significant stronghold, they need to ensure that they somehow capture that Hispanic vote, and that has been a major problem for Republicans. And then Asians overall tend to be more Republican and conservative. In terms of age, well, youth tends to be more liberal as we think about the liberalizing effect of college. The elderly, who tend to be most involved in politics in terms of just voting, tend to be more conservative. As we said earlier, women tend to be more liberal, men more conservative. Wealthier, more conservative, race minorities more liberal, as we've also mentioned, and we mentioned all of these other significant influences in terms of how people vote. In terms of turnout, that matters by age, schooling, and race. The older you are, the more likely you are to engage in voting. The less, or the younger I should say, you are. Look at this here, right here. People between the ages of 18 and 24 tend to show up on elections much less compared to their older counterparts. In terms of schooling, if you have a bachelor's degree or more, you're most likely to come out and vote, whereas if you just have less than a high school education, most likely you will not. In terms of race, whites tend to vote much more in terms of African Americans and Hispanics, so interesting turnouts there. Now, as I said before, that we lumped liberals and conservatives as the two main ideologies, but there's also libertarians who tend to have, if you're a big Ron Paul fan, you'd be a libertarian here, support individual liberties and a strict limitation on government. You want minimal government intervention in the economy as well as in politics and your rights. The government should have a very small role. So one of their big things, end the FBI, end the CIA, repeal the income tax. The complete opposite of that is socialism. If you remember your study of Karl Marx, they're all for the governmental system of public ownership, where the government is in charge of the means of production and exchange. They're all about greater federal involvement and helping out the poor especially. But really, for these ideologies, where it comes down to for them is civil rights, economics, and public and personal issues. This is really what defines whether or not you're a conservative, a libertarian, a liberal, or a socialist. Many, many factors involved. So in Unit 2, Part 2, in our next video, we will look at more at political participation and continue from there. All right, thank you.